So the 2024 election is about a year away, and so far we're looking at a rematch between former President Donald Trump and current President Joe Biden for the 2024 election. So, in today's video, we're going to look at how a hypothetical matchup between these candidates could go, the round two of these two going at it. And of course, we're going to take a look at favorability polling for both candidates, as well as compare some of the recent election results to what we could expect to see in 2024, some of the trends going on there, and, where these candidates will improve and where these candidates might end up losing some support. So, this is probably the most likely scenario, obviously, at this point in time. I mean, if we take a look at Republican primary polling, Donald Trump is by far and away the leading candidate on the Republican side. He's up in some cases by nearly 50 points in essentially every polling aggregate. The lowest is FiveThirtyEight, which has him at 42.5% ahead of everybody else. But the second runner-up, Ron DeSantis, is at 15% in that average, and that's the best average for him. The lowest is 12%. So you're really looking at a dire situation for the DeSantis campaign. All the other Republicans have really failed to make ground, and unless they coalesce behind one candidate very, very quickly, it's very, very unlikely for any of them to end up beating Donald Trump for the nomination. And even in that scenario where they all coalesce, Donald Trump still probably leads them 66-33. So, that's just the state of the Republican primary at this point in time. That's why I think this is by far and away the most likely scenario. But what really throws a wrench in this is all the legal cases against Donald Trump, the criminal indictments. There are civil cases where he's being fined millions and millions of dollars. So, those could potentially shake up the race. But of course, for the sake of this hypothetical, Donald Trump is the nominee on election day against Joe Biden. So as always in these videos, we'll start off with the West and move our way east. But of course, before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So we'll start off with the swing state of Nevada. Now, Nevada, we always talk about in these videos, is one of those states where Republicans never really seem to break through, or if they do, it's really in just a perfect storm kind of scenario. We saw that back in 2022. Adam Laxalt, who was a pretty strong candidate on the Republican side, I think really just got hurt by abortion. Nevada is one of the most pro-choice states in the country, very staunch pro-life conservative. Again, very strong candidate, comes from a long line of Republicans in the Laxalt family, but it just wasn't enough. Catherine Cortez Masto had strong support from the culinary unions in Clark County, and that really made the difference. They didn't show up for Steve Sisolak. They did show up for Catherine Cortez Masto, and I think that honestly really made the difference. When we compare these results, for instance, the Senate race to the gubernatorial race, you have a 52-45 margin for Catherine Cortez Masto in Clark County, the largest county in the state, where roughly 2/3 of Nevada residents live. And then, of course, you have a 51-45 margin for Steve Sisolak. So, Steve Sisolak only really did about a point worse, but that point, of course, has statewide implications. Also, Washoe County, home to Reno, you have Steve Sisolak only winning there by around 1.5. Catherine Cortez Masto wins there by 5 points. So that's really where the biggest swing in this race was. So in order for Donald Trump to be able to flip the state of Nevada, he's going to probably have to come close, if not win Washoe County, and do even better than Adam Laxalt did in Clark County. And at this point in time, I really don't see that happening. When we take a look at Donald Trump's favorability, it's underwater by about 14.5 points. Joe Biden's favorability is about underwater by about 14 points. So the two candidates are essentially equally as unpopular, but you do have Biden as the incumbent. You do have Trump as sort of the out-of-office chaos candidate. And while that did work in 2016, as of right now, I really don't see that working in 2020. So I think Joe Biden would probably end up winning the state of Nevada by around 2 points, very similar to what we saw back in 2020 and in 2016. I think that Donald Trump will do worse in Washoe County, even if he does marginally better in Clark County. That's exactly what we saw back in 2020. Donald Trump improved very, very narrowly in Clark County by around 1.5, but he did worse in Washoe County by around 3.3%. So that's really why he didn't end up winning the state of Nevada. He didn't improve enough in Clark County, and he ended up doing worse in Washoe County. And these two counties probably make up around nearly 90% of the population of Nevada. So, that's really a done deal. So I think you're going to see Washoe County probably trend left to where it was in 2020, even if Donald Trump does make gains in Clark, but I suspect he might even lose ground down there as well. So Nevada would go to Joe Biden in this scenario. Moving on down to Arizona. This is one of those old guard Republican states that Republicans have been doing very poorly in. You take a look back at 2020, Donald Trump lost the state of Arizona by 0.3. He lost Maricopa County by 2.2%. This is the most populous county by far. Just like Nevada, this county makes up about 2/3 of the entire state's population. So if you lose here, you really have to make the ground up elsewhere. And, Donald Trump wasn't able to do that. In 2022, we saw something very similar with Kari Lake, Abe Hamadeh, these other Republican candidates. Blake Masters did the worst by far, so we won't really talk about him. But, Kari Lake got a really close result in Arizona. She did worse than Donald Trump in the state, losing by around 0.7%. And she lost Maricopa County by 2 points, very similar to Donald Trump, and she wasn't able to make up the ground elsewhere. She lost Pima County by a larger margin, 61-39. Donald Trump only lost Pima County 58-40. So, looking at the results, Kari Lake did worse than Donald Trump. Even if she improved in some of these smaller rural counties, Yuma County, she did better, 56-45. Donald Trump only won Yuma County by 6. So Kari Lake was able to win Yuma by a safe margin, but it's not exactly a populous county, so it really didn't matter at the end of the day. Republicans did actually see a statewide flip in Arizona. It was actually with the superintendent of public instruction, which won by around 0.4%. And, he lost Maricopa County, but he did better in Pima County, 59-41. And he was able to run up the margins in the rural areas and outrun Kari Lake and the other statewide Republicans. So the path to winning Arizona for Republicans is really running it up big in the rurals and not losing Maricopa County by more than 2 points. If you lose Maricopa County by more than 2 points, you're basically done in the state. Donald Trump has yet to prove he can reverse suburban erosion. Maricopa County is a very urban suburban county. This county has been drifting left for decades. I don't really see it drifting back even in a Trump-Biden matchup. I think Biden would probably win the state of Arizona again, and he'd probably win it by around 2 to 3 points. I think Donald Trump would probably do slightly better in the rural counties. He'd do better in Yuma County. He'd probably get closer to where Kari Lake was potentially. Do better in some of these other safe red counties, but his real loss is going to be in Maricopa County and probably Pima County as well. So, while he improves potentially in the rural areas and might even do better in some of the majority minority counties, Apache, places like that, I think he's going to do worse in the suburban counties, and that's what's going to cost him in Arizona. Moving on down to Alaska, this state really isn't that competitive, but it has been drifting left lately. We talked about this in some of the other hypothetical matchups. Donald Trump only won the state of Alaska by 10 points, 52.8 to 42.8. So Joe Biden doesn't have exactly a large share of the vote in Alaska, but we've seen Alaska vote for Democrats since then. We have Mary Peltola, the state representative from Alaska. She ended up winning, I think, by a pretty large margin back in the 2022 House elections. She ended up winning the state by 11 points. And this is a state that is safe red normally on the presidential level. So, Mary Peltola is not your run-of-the-mill Democrat, but it does go to show you that Alaska doesn't really like these sort of Trumpian MAGA Republicans. Sarah Palin really tried to tie herself to Trump. Sarah Palin had her own problems in Alaska, though she was very unpopular to begin with. So it really wasn't a Trump thing, more so just Sarah Palin being an atrocious candidate. But, it's very arguable that Nick Begich also would have lost as well. So both the Republicans running in Alaska weren't really ideal. And of course, you saw a flip there. I think Donald Trump would probably win Alaska by 8 points. But again, the state's drifting closer and closer towards the Democrats. Do I really think it will flip by the end of the decade? Probably not, but it's going to keep getting closer and closer. It's only 3 electoral votes, so I don't really think Alaska is going to be contested really heavily by either side. But nonetheless, there is sort of a trend there. Anchorage, the urban areas of Alaska have been moving left. They've previously been much more conservative, so that's why you really see a shift over in Alaska. Moving on over to the great state of Texas. This was a state that Donald Trump only won by around 5.5 points back in 2020. We talk about Texas a lot because it's a state that's been shifting left over the past couple of decades. Bush won Texas 61-38 back in 2004. McCain only wins it by 12. Romney wins it by around 15. And then, of course, you have Donald Trump in 2016 win it by 9 and then win it by 5.5. So this state's getting very, very close to the edge. And honestly, Texas would have been even closer had Donald Trump not made tremendous gains in the Rio Grande Valley, winning over a lot of these Hispanic voters in these rural counties. So Donald Trump, if he wants to do better in the state of Texas, he's not only going to have to improve in the Rio Grande Valley, but he's going to have to improve in urban centers like Dallas, Houston. He's not going to improve in Travis. I don't really think any Republican's going to improve in Travis County. This area has just been zooming to the left, very progressive. Greg Abbott did worse in Travis County than Donald Trump. So really any Republican is going to do awful here. And I think the trends are just only accelerating as time goes on. Travis County's really become politically a lot more like Portland, Oregon, or Seattle than a big city in Texas. Dallas County has also shifted to the left, by around 5.5 points, 6 points. So not as dramatic as Travis County, which shifted about 7, but it's really the Austin suburbs that have moved the biggest to the left. Hays County moving 12 points to the left. Williamson County, 11 points to the left. So it's not even just Austin anymore, but it's bleeding out into the suburbs as well. This is going to have a big impact on any Republican running in Texas. Donald Trump, I think, brings Texas really close because he's not going to win Fort Worth. He lost Fort Worth very narrowly back in 2020. In 2016, interestingly enough, Donald Trump actually won Fort Worth by around 8 points. So he did pretty well here compared to how Republicans are doing today. And honestly, it's remarkable looking back at the 2016 election, how well, quote unquote, Donald Trump did in these suburban and exurban counties compared to where Republicans are now. So that just goes to show you that even since 2016, there's been massive erosion in the suburbs. So, I think Donald Trump wins the state of Texas. I think he wins it by around 2 points, which would put it just on the cusp of lean. So we'll put it in the lean Republican category for now. He might end up losing a place like Collin County. I think that's probably going to flip in 2024 if Trump's the nominee. Denton County probably stays red. But again, you're going to bring Texas dangerously close to flipping. And of course, for the GOP, that is certainly a nightmare scenario. Moving up to Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. This was a district that Joe Biden won by nearly 7 points. I think he's going to win it again by a similar margin. The suburbs of Omaha have been trending more and more to the left. Ben Sasse, Don Bacon, these are really the only Republicans that are still able to win in Nebraska's 2nd. I think Jim Pillen back in 2022 won this district by 0.1%. So it's trending left. It doesn't even matter which Republican it is. These urban areas are just getting more and more Democratic. So, even somebody like Ron DeSantis, I think, would probably lose Nebraska's 2nd. The only candidate I think that could probably win it is maybe somebody like Nikki Haley, but we're sort of getting to the point where no Republican is going to win the 2nd congressional district in its current incarnation. And I will say that this is not the current drawing of Nebraska's 2nd. I pointed this out in the Ron DeSantis video, but YapMS has a 2nd version that's in demo, and I don't use that because I can't change the names of the candidates, but that has the updated maps for Nebraska and Maine in terms of the congressional districts. So they are a bit different than they appear on the screen. This isn't the current 2nd congressional district. It stretches more out into some of the rural parts of the state. Moving on up to Minnesota, not much to talk about here. Biden will win Minnesota pretty comfortably. Trends in Minnesota, I think, have just been unfavorable to Republicans in the sense that while they are improving in the rural parts of the state, they're just doing much worse in the urban regions, and they can't really make up the ground in the rurals. So even if the Iron Range had trended more and more to the right, we saw it trend right big back in 2016, but that still wasn't enough. This was the closest Minnesota had come to flipping for Republicans, probably since 2000. I think Minnesota was fairly close by around a point or so, if I'm not mistaken. So this was the closest Minnesota's been to flipping for decades at this point. And, even then, Hillary Clinton still won the state by 1.5%. That's because the urban areas trended more to the left and kind of bailed her out. Otherwise, Minnesota could have easily gone red to Donald Trump. And perhaps if the 2016 campaign had unfolded a bit differently, perhaps if you didn't have Access Hollywood, maybe it would have narrowly flipped, just like New Hampshire. But of course, there's a lot of what ifs in that scenario. Minnesota's not in flipping territory this time around. It was a 7-point margin for Joe Biden. And that was even after the rioting and civil unrest you saw in Minneapolis, where Republicans were really trying to hone in on law and order politics, and it just didn't work in the state, and I don't think that message is going to resonate, and the Republican message just in general isn't really resonating in the Minneapolis suburbs. So, I think this will probably go likely to Joe Biden. I really don't think Republicans should spend any time trying to contest Minnesota. Moving on down to Iowa, this potentially could be a state where Donald Trump could improve. I lean towards saying he'll do about the same where he did last time, maybe slightly worse, just because I think he's going to underperform in some of these urban counties, Polk County, Lynn County, Johnson County. These areas, I think Donald Trump is going to do worse, and they're going to trend more and more to the left. But you could potentially see some trending to the right in some of these rural counties. Again, Iowa's sort of a state in political transition. You have the rural areas that are still trending more and more to the right. And a lot of these light red counties that are like majority white working class, there's lots of room for Republicans to grow here theoretically. So, in theory, Iowa could trend more and more to the right as time goes on. But of course, all trends have their end. All trends can be reversed. So I think Donald Trump would probably win the state by a likely margin. We'll say 6-7, just because I think he does slightly worse in those urban counties. Moving on up to Wisconsin, this was one of the closest states back in 2020. It was the third closest state. Donald Trump only lost the state of Wisconsin by 0.6%. So Biden actually won the state by a smaller margin than Donald Trump did back in 2016. And Trump 2016 was an incredibly impressive victory because Wisconsin hadn't voted for a Republican nominee for president since 1984, since Reagan's 84 landslide. So it was incredibly significant to see a Republican actually win here. And it's really because Hillary Clinton was just such a poor candidate and Donald Trump was able to sort of do the balancing act. He did just well enough in the urban areas around Milwaukee, the suburban counties, and did, of course, just well enough in the rural areas to win the state very, very narrowly. And in 2020, he almost pulled it off. Probably without COVID, it's safe to say he probably would have won the state of Wisconsin very narrowly. But, taking a look at these trends, I think these trends in the WOW counties are really going to hurt Republicans. I also think you could see potentially the driftless area in southwestern Wisconsin trend more towards the left or back to the left because these counties were much bluer, obviously, before 2020. So, Wisconsin is one of those states where I think Donald Trump would probably end up losing to Joe Biden by a narrow margin. I think it'd be around 1.5 or so, 1.5, maybe bordering around 2 points. It really all depends on how blue the WOW counties get. But again, as I've said with the other states on this map, I don't see Donald Trump making inroads in suburban areas with white college-educated voters. And these are the voters that are leaving the GOP in droves in these well-off suburbs. And these places have high turnout. So that's really, I think, what does Donald Trump in the state of Wisconsin. Moving on over to Michigan, I don't think Donald Trump is going to win Michigan. I said in 2020 Donald Trump wasn't going to win Michigan. I was right about that. He lost it by nearly 3 points. I think Joe Biden probably wins Michigan by 5. This state has just been trending more and more towards the left. You saw in the 2022 midterms resoundingly reject the Republicans' messaging there, and albeit Tudor Dixon and some of the Republican candidates there, Christina Caramo, were the worst messengers for the Republican message. But nonetheless, this is a state that we all need to remember is still a blue state. 2016 was very much a fluke, I think, in terms of Michigan actually flipping. It would have been very similar to Minnesota flipping, although because Trump actually contested Michigan in 2020, it was probably a lot closer. But the suburbs around Detroit, the Grand Rapids area, these areas have been zooming towards the left ever since 2016. Grand Rapids trended nearly 10 points to the left, Ottawa County nearly 9 points. So while Donald Trump could theoretically do better in these rural counties, these are the places where I think he's really going to be done in, southeastern Michigan, the Detroit area, and sort of Grand Rapids. He just is bleeding support there, and I think even other Republicans are bleeding support there. That just goes to show you that these areas in general are just moving away from the Republican Party. So that's why I put this in the lean Biden category. In Ohio, I think Donald Trump benefits from the same trends as in Iowa, that being that there's still room for Republicans to grow in the state of Ohio. You still see northeastern Ohio trending more towards the right, a lot of rural southern Ohio trending towards the right, even as you have these urban counties around Columbus, Cincinnati, all trending towards the left. So you do have Republicans beating the trends in Ohio, but it's a question of how long, because if Columbus continues to go further towards the left, Delaware County flips, you lose ground to some of these northeastern counties, the Republicans are in big trouble and they won't be able to hold on to the state. But obviously, I don't think Donald Trump's at risk for that right now. Even with the indictments, even what's happening with him, I still think he probably wins the state by around 6 or 7 points. So similar to Iowa, I think the margin would be very close. I think Delaware County probably flips to Joe Biden. You could potentially see some of these northeastern counties potentially revert. But, these white working class counties have been moving more towards the right. It's very likely that places like Dayton County are going to get bluer. Hamilton County gets bluer. Of course, Delaware County, a suburban county outside of Columbus, probably flipping towards Joe Biden. Moving on up to Maine's 2nd Congressional District, Donald Trump won the 2nd Congressional District of Maine by about 7 points, so similar to the Nebraska District, only reversed. This district, I think he holds on to pretty easily. I think he'll probably win it by a similar margin, which would put Maine at large probably at around Joe Biden plus 10, maybe plus 11. So I think Maine at large, the Portland area probably trends more towards the left. You probably have the rural areas stay about the same. In New Hampshire, I really don't think the state's going to be that close in 2024. You do have this sort of history with New Hampshire where it tends to vote against the incumbent president. We've seen that really in every election since 2000. It's debatable if that happens in the 2024 elections. Going back to 2016, New Hampshire was almost won by Donald Trump. The dynamic here has changed quite a bit. While Chris Sununu and sort of the more local New Hampshire GOP has been pretty successful here, the Donald Trump branded candidates, other statewide Republicans, the Don Bolduc types, they don't really do well in New Hampshire. And I still think that New Hampshire probably is a likely Biden state at the end of the day. The local GOP is much stronger here than the federal GOP. I think it's because they know the state well and they know how to run in the state. And I think somebody like Donald Trump is just toxic in a New England state like New Hampshire, even though it is much closer than, its neighboring states like Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, etc. Moving on down to the Keystone State, and this state will make the difference in the 2024 election. We're at 268, 180 right now. Going back to the 2020 election, this was one of the closer states. It was the fourth closest state, I believe, behind Georgia, Arizona, and Wisconsin. Donald Trump lost by 1.2%, and his loss really came from the fact that he did significantly worse in the Philadelphia collar counties and just eastern Pennsylvania more broadly. Even as in parts of western Pennsylvania he was able to improve, this is really what did him in. It was these counties right here. Cumberland County, which is a suburban county outside Harrisburg, trending more towards the left, I think by nearly 8 percentage points there. And all these other northeastern counties as well. Pike County moving 7 points to the left. Chester County moving nearly 8. Montgomery County 5. Bucks County, Montour County, etc. So just eastern Pennsylvania in general, Donald Trump has been eroding support. And of course, we've seen further erosion for GOP support there when we take a look at the Senate map between Dr. Oz and John Fetterman, because it really was these northeastern blue collar red counties where you saw some of the biggest erosions. Luzerne County, Dr. Oz only won by around 9 points. Carbon County, Dr. Oz only won 60-37. The only counties that I think trended slightly to the right, if I'm not mistaken, was Pike County and I think Monroe County. So these two counties that bordered New Jersey and New York. And someone on Twitter brought up a very interesting point that perhaps this was due to the fact that these counties are in the New York media market and they were seeing all the Republican ads on crime. Certainly could be the case. But nonetheless, the rest of the state really just trending very, very leftward. The biggest trends against the Republicans in Pennsylvania was actually in Western PA. This was sort of Fetterman's home turf. This was where he had the biggest advantage. And the smallest trends to the left were actually in the Philly collar counties. So had Dr. Oz done significantly better in Western PA and just rural PA more broadly, he probably would have won this race. And places like Scranton, he loses Scranton by 16 points. Donald Trump only lost Scranton by 8 back in 2020, and he only lost Scranton by 4, I believe, in 2016. So in order to win Pennsylvania, you got to strike the right balance. You have to bring Chester County down to really single digits. And, Republicans have been very, very bad at doing that ever since 2016, with the exception of Stacey Garrity and Timothy DeFleur, which I think both of them lost Chester County by high single digits or very low double digits, around 10 points. But, Dr. Oz losing Chester County by 17 points just isn't going to cut it. Same with Montgomery going 63-35 in favor of John Fetterman. Bucks County trending more to the left. You can't have these trends if you want to win the state. So Donald Trump has done better in these counties. But again, Chester County, I think he's only going to do worse in this county, is just zooming towards the left again. The white college-educated voters we were talking about, they make up a big portion of the population here. Bucks County is more white working class, but you still have a very educated populace here, also moving towards the left. And, it really depends on how he does in these more working class areas around Scranton and just eastern Pennsylvania more broadly. So if Donald Trump wants to win Pennsylvania, he's going to have to do significantly better in northeastern and rural Pennsylvania than he did in even 2020. So as of right now, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think Joe Biden would probably win Pennsylvania by 3. We're going to talk about the Pennsylvania Supreme Court race probably later on this week. That's a race that's very important as well. That will determine whether or not Democrats add to their majority in the Supreme Court there or not. And it's also the first statewide race we've seen in Pennsylvania since last year's midterm elections. Moving on down to North Carolina, This is a state that's always been sort of teetering on the edge of flipping. Back in 2020, Donald Trump only won the state by 1.3%, and that was really thanks to the trends that we saw in the so-called Black Belt in northeastern North Carolina, and also the southeastern portion of the state, which saw pretty big trends towards the right, which sort of bailed out Donald Trump, because in terms of the urban trends, they were very much against him. Wake County, home to Raleigh, trending about 6 points to the left. Mecklenburg County, home to Charlotte, going around 6. It was the exurban counties, too, around Charlotte that were pretty bad. Cabarrus County, going down to just single digits for Donald Trump, 54 to 44.5. Union County getting significantly closer. So, if Donald Trump doesn't improve in these exurban and urban counties, he's going to lose North Carolina in 2024. Even if he does better in northeastern North Carolina, he does better in the South, he needs to improve in one of these urban metro areas or else he's going to lose the state. And I think he's only eroding support since where he was during 2020. So I think as of right now, Donald Trump would narrowly lose North Carolina, and that's certainly one of the more controversial calls. I think it would be very close, 0.3 to 0.5, but I just don't see him making up the ground in Mecklenburg, in Raleigh, in these other areas. You would have to see a monumental shift in northeastern North Carolina and, improvements in the western portion of the state, places like Asheville zooming towards the left, just all the urban areas. So I really don't see a path for Donald Trump unless he improves in the suburban and urban areas, and I haven't seen Donald Trump have the ability to do that since the 2016 election, even against a candidate as weak as Joe Biden. Moving on down to South Carolina, this is a state that's not really going to be that close. Republicans benefit from very positive trends here. You do have a lot of Republican voters moving to the state of South Carolina, even as you have some of the urban areas like Charleston, Columbia moving towards the left. You do have other rural parts of the state moving towards the right. So at this point in time, I think Donald Trump would win the state of South Carolina by around 10. So that technically puts it in the likely category. Some people consider 10 points as safe. If you want to see my rankings, they're always in the description down below. But that's where I would put South Carolina. The state of Georgia, I think Donald Trump runs into the same problem we've talked about in every one of these other swing states. It's just the fact that the suburbs are trending too far away from the Republican Party. Brian Kemp is sort of the exception, not the rule. He was able to bring up other statewide candidates in Georgia to victory. But, taking a look at these suburban counties back in 2020 and comparing them to 2016, double-digit shifts to the left in nearly all of them. So a real disaster for the Republican Party in Georgia. And, Donald Trump is probably only going to further erode support in these areas. They're demographically changing. You have more minority voters in these counties than you did back in 2016. You have more educated voters, and these are both demographics that go heavily towards the Democrats. So even geographically, most of the state, being red, evangelical, it really doesn't matter because the Atlanta metro area is around 60% of Georgia's population, and the trends are just undeniable. I think it does take a sort of special type of Republican to win Georgia as of right now. So I think you're probably going to see a margin very similar to what we saw back in the 2022 runoffs. The state probably going +2, maybe D+3, but I think Donald Trump probably loses Georgia at this point in time. And this, of course, leaves the state of Florida, a state that Republicans have been benefiting from very positive trends. Back in 2016, Donald Trump only won the state of Florida by 1.2%. Fast forward to the 2020 election, Donald Trump wins 51-48, so he wins by over 3 percentage points, and that's mostly thanks to the shifts we saw in southeastern Florida, specifically Miami-Dade County. And since 2020, you've seen hundreds of thousands of quote-unquote COVID refugees, Republicans, conservatives from blue states moving down to Florida, setting up roots here, and they're voting Republican. We saw the impacts of that in 2022 with DeSantis's win, with Marco Rubio's win. So even as Donald Trump does worse in these other states, I actually think he would do better in the state of Florida just because of the trends there. I could see him winning the state of Florida by 5 points as of right now. So Florida, for the first time in probably decades, would be voting to the right of a place like Texas. So it would be truly remarkable, but that's really just where the trends indicate the state is going. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Joe Biden winning 319 to Donald Trump's 219. This is where I see the race as of right now. Again, we're still a year out, And obviously, if the data changes, these predictions change. But I figured I'd wrap up this 2024 hypothetical series for the time being with the Donald Trump-Joe Biden matchup, since none of the other Republicans really meet the threshold. They're so far below the Republican polls that they're not even remotely likely to get the nomination. So there's really no point in talking about them. It would just be a baseless hypothetical. You could argue this one is too, and some of the others, but I figure at least we ought to do the top four because they're a lot more relevant than some of the other Republicans in the pack right now. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.